Hi everyone, this is my coming out story. No, I'm just kidding. This is about what it means to be a queer environmentalist. Today, I want to share a personal story about my own queer identity and how it intersects with my environmental work I do today, and why I use the name Queer Brown Vegan, because I want to be sure that people know that I am part of the LGBTQ plus community. Before we get started, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as this video is going to go delve into the queer ecological history of my own life and the work that I've done. Growing up young, I was a very unique kid, I'd say. I think the idea of queerness was not really exposed to me until later in life, but my early childhood in life, I always remember being picked on by a lot of guy friends. I was a very shy kid growing up in school. I remember I didn't really talk much. I mean, I wasn't silent either, but I had a few friends and really just minded my own business because I was bullied for having like coconut hair, which is like the coconut bowl lifestyle. And that was a huge disaster. But you know, I think for myself, I didn't really get exposed to the idea that LGBT people existed until I was later in like late elementary school and middle school. This is when terms like gay, lesbiana, hoto, like in my culture, was being used, and I was like, what do those words mean? In middle school, this is back in like 2006, 7, and 8 years. Lady Gaga was the first queer icon for a lot of young people, which I love her work today. And everything she's done. And there was the Motorola Razr chocolate or colored cherry rose colored phones, and all of this like new pop culture stuff was emerging. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and I remember really dealing with these internal feelings that I didn't really feel like I liked girls, and I said I liked girls, but I also like guys at the same time, and I didn't really have anyone to talk to or look up to. And I remember like even in like my own household, like both my dad and mom were extremely homophobic. Like I think anything that came about with LGBT news or like any pride flag, they'd get annoyed and like change the channel and be like, "Ugh, I don't want to watch this," or "Let's not watch this. It's toxic for your brain." And I think that's when I started to recognize that maybe something was wrong with me and that it's just a phase that I like guys. And it wasn't until I think high school that I started to recognize in my own environmental work that I knew what I wanted to do academically. I knew that I was set to go to college, that I was going to be studying environmental science. I had a really great stronghold of friends. I had great siblings that loved me, and my parents loved me to a certain extent. But I had this issue of just not being comfortable with who I was. I didn't really talk about sexuality. I remember always being very uncomfortable when people talked about liking someone or loving someone, and I think that was really a reflection that I didn't really accept of who I was, or I didn't feel comfortable really talking about it. And it wasn't until I think prom that I came out to my best friend that I was like queer, or bisexual they would call it in that time. And that started off the new journey of my queer experience. And when I got into college, I really thought the same that it was going to be in high school, is that you can't talk about your queer identity. You have to keep it sacred to yourself because you're going to be met with pushback. And it was the complete opposite. In fact, many of my friends in early college were all queer and trans folks. Now, as I was doing environmental work in undergrad and I was proudly out there to say, yes, I'm queer, I really had this idea struggling with the terminologies of like bisexual, gay, and queer. I think for me, I recognize that it's really weird to say this, but I do find women attractive, but I don't find them sexually attractive. And I have always had to really clarify with people on that end that, I may have feelings for different genders and, really accepting this idea of like full abundance of love. And so I think I didn't call myself queer until later in college. But as an environmentalist specifically, I've always felt really ashamed to talk about it in academic experiences. For many of you know, the environmental space is very heavily white male dominated. With that comes a lot of repercussions of course, there's racism, but there's also the other layer of homophobia or transphobia for my trans folks. And I always felt like, well, that's insignificant for me to bring into these spaces. But the more and more I pushed myself away from not talking about my queer identity, the more I realized that I felt that people felt a bit uncomfortable or they felt confused of who I was as an individual, and I wanted to change that. In academic experiences, I always felt that I had to shy away from my queer identity, especially because already racism was very rampant in academic institutions. And during this time of undergrad college, I remember seeing photos of myself, and I really struggled not with the idea of who I was any more than an individual, but the acceptance that came from my familiar relationships. And I meant that from like my parents' side. Of course, my siblings were super, supportive of me, but I felt that there was always a gap between my parents and I when I would come back from college, visit them, try to explain about, what things I've been going through. But as an immigrant of color, the priorities for many first gen students is to just succeed and flourish in academia. But it was the complete opposite. I was very struggling at the time. And it wasn't until I think later that I read an article about the intersections between queer communities and climate change. And that really helped me feel like, okay, what I'm doing is not wrong. In fact, I'm contributing to this movement to actually make it even better. There was an article that basically talked about that frontline communities, which are people or communities of individuals that are the ones that are going to be the most affected on the climate crisis. And this gives actually more accurate, specific language that these people are usually Black, Indigenous people of color who live in poverty, people who are disabled, people who are undocumented, and people who are queer and trans. It said that around 40%, I believe, of people that face homelessness in the United States, 30 to 40% of them identify as LGBT. I started to make the interconnections between queer identities, environmental culture, and social and racial justice. And that article allowed me to feel validated that there was other queer environmentalists doing work for climate justice, because I really struggled to find queer and trans environmental mentors that were specifically Black and brown. And I feel that for myself as a queer person of color, I feel that queerness is sometimes not allowed with people of color. And I'm saying this in the idea that the embodiment, the expression, and the ways that we navigate the world needs to be always policed in a way. Instead, the ways of imagery that I saw in the LGBT communities were usually either extremely buff white men or extremely white, thin cis gay men. And I'm not saying, specifically like white gay people are the issue, but the idea of like who is allowed to talk about queerness and queer theory without feeling like they're going to be attacked. And I feel that for a lot of Black and brown people of color, we are really indoctrinated to perpetuate and uphold values of homophobia and transphobia. And it isn't until we unlearn those values that we accept who we are, because that is something that I really struggled with as when I was a teenager. And it really broke my heart that as I read more about the future of queer ecological justice, is that I said, is there a future for me to be in this industry? Because I'm not straight. I'm a person of color, and I'm also vegan. These are all different layers that I had to really navigate for myself to understand, is this going to be a viable career? As I understood that queer and trans communities played a huge role in the environmental movement and that I needed to find a mentor, I also struggled with the fact of how does this still relate to my environmental work, and how do I relate this to the dominant LGBT community? One of the biggest issues I think I really struggle with in LGBT spaces is bringing the intersection of queer ecology in these spaces. I think it's really easy for dominant spaces like the environmental space, LGBT space, Latin space, to consider the different intersecting issues that really affect us on our daily lives. And I remember just trying to understand where my other queer and trans friends were coming from, because they've been people that have been trying to survive, right? Our networks of survival were based on community. So for many of us, our families did not accept us. And so I had this very unique relationship of trying to find out, who I was while I was in college. And luckily when I graduated and I felt even more confident in who I was, I think there was a series of myself of understanding what queer ecology meant. And I talked about queer ecology in another video, but basically when I learned about queer ecology and understanding that it challenges heteronormative dominant values of what is seen as natural versus unnatural, and really disrupts and values diversity of thought instead of uniformity, I said to myself that, this is the most conceptual framework that I can use for myself, but I can also apply it to a lot of people's lives to learn that what it means to be a queer environmentalist to me is that I'm really extending this idea of what liberation and the expression of identity can look like. I know that a lot of people always ask why I use he, they pronouns, and something that I don't really talk about a lot is my identity as an individual that uses he, they pronouns. I think for myself internally, I've always seen myself as a human being. I never really, you would say, like prescribe a lot to what a quote unquote man looks like. But I think externally why I use he, they pronouns is recognizing that I can still walk down the street and be perceived as a male, usually straight male, and be safe versus other, gay men or non-binary folks or trans folks do not have that same privilege that I do because I dress quote unquote masculine. And I want to be clear that when I use masculine in this terminology in this video, I'm meaning that the ways in which our dominant society sees masculinity, not so much the disruption that masculine is sacred and not part of gender. And I'm trying to disrupt both ends, but just for clarity of this video. And I think I've been really come to terms with this idea that I still use he, they pronouns because many of my queer and trans siblings are dying today and they don't get that same safety. I think when we talk about the environmental space and allowing for queer and trans ideologies and thoughts to be put in, it's always met with a bit pushback because I think it's seen as unnatural. But we have to remember that a lot of queer and trans histories have been erased. And in the United States specifically, I mean, the HIV endemic that essentially, hurt and a lot of people were infected, that we lost a lot of queer elders. And so it's really sad for me to see the new generation of, Gen Z and also younger people will have new environmental leaders to look up to. And I'm really happy to see that. And I recognize that as someone that didn't always have that mentorship, I also feel a bit sometimes disconnected. So I always tell my friends whenever they're struggling with trying to understand what their role is as a queer environmentalist, I always say to come home, not come over, because I believe that home doesn't need to look like a certain bloodline of family. It can look like anyone can be your family. And this is used a lot in queer and trans rhetoric, that family, the concept of family is not defined by blood. The concept of family is built on the ideology of care and being able to love each other through unconditional love and to be able to hold each other accountable. With that being said, I know that there is a lot of you that probably struggle with this idea of what role do queer environmentalists play, and we're honestly everywhere. If you look actually in different industries, you will now find a lot of LGBTQ plus people in these industries, and know the fact that you are not alone in this space, and queer environmentalists are redefining this world. So for Pride Month, I wanted to share why queer environmentalism matters and why a lot of us, even in LGBT spaces and allies, should be advocating for more LGBT inclusivity. So thank you so much, everyone, and let me know your thoughts below.